Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the second Esther Han episode, which will be as chock full of good stuff as the first one was. Rose, do you want to know what I'm loving and not loving?
What are you loving and not loving, Dana?
This sounds a little weird, but we have our first troll on social media.
I know.
And okay, let me tell you why I'm loving that instead of not loving it. Of course, I don't love stupid trolling. However, it shows engagement with our YouTube channel and our LinkedIn channel. And it's just great to see people starting to seek out what's there.
You know that the Future of Work YouTube snippet has over 400 views.
Yeah, I know.
For our little podcast.
So anyway, that just feels good to see some of it getting out there and hopefully having some impact. Although the impact on this particular troll, he wasn't happy with the sentiment.
He wasn't happy with the fact that I was saying people should get back in the office. I think the exact quote is, "This is bullshit."
And I'm assuming it's a he. I can't actually know that for sure. So I should say they.
We only said he because I think there was a masculine name in the handle. So,
and we did remove the comments.
Just FYI. Yeah.
There were swear words in it.
Yeah.
Okay, what I'm not loving is my laptop's officially too old to podcast on.
That was a bummer.
I want to keep our listeners updated on our struggles with technology related to this. So there you have it. What are you loving and not loving, Rose?
I know I've said this one before, but it's gaining momentum, so I have to acknowledge it. I am loving the excitement around people watching women's sports. The quality is outstanding. The participation and the viewership is off the charts. And hopefully this leads to a future of strong followership and pay and excitement around women's sports. We saw it initially in soccer. Now we're seeing it in basketball. So I'm loving that. What I'm not loving is you try and buy tickets to these events. The price point has gotten really high.
Yes.
The price point is crazy. This is going to timestamp this a bit, but it's Final Four. My husband is a Purdue grad, so trying to get tickets to the event, and it is exceptionally costly unless you want to take your binoculars to watch a basketball game in a football stadium, which isn't a great viewing experience. So that's what I'm not liking. I'm loving the excitement. I'm not loving the price point that comes with it.
Right. There we go. Capitalism marches on.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we are now heading into the final Esther Han episode. She has so many interesting things to share, insights into her organization's approach to work from home and what the right mix is. Very different from Roly Acosta's, if you listen to that. And generally just a lot of rich stuff around how she manages and leads her team. So here we go, rock and roll. Esther, you've heard me say this, and you've probably heard it on our podcast, that we're believers that you do need a leadership mindset. You also need a management mindset in just about any role. Now, the mix might be different, but leadership's often what's celebrated. Like, that's the cool thing to be, and management's boring. And by management, just ensuring that the work is enabled and that people are getting feedback on their work and all that. And so I'm just curious of your point of view on that and like how it's manifested for you in your role or roles.
Well, just staying on AI as sort of an example or a context, I saw at a conference, there are more vendors that have AI-enabled fill in the blank, right? And so from the perspective of trying to do innovation and more testing and verifying and being in a resource-constrained environment, I was very open to, oh, that's really cool. What is that about? Let me learn. And rather than it just being me, I just invited people from different teams to say, you know what, there's a company out there. They usually do, new venture consulting, but they've got this AI-enabled process that helps speed up discovery and help generate more ideas. And they actually do some of the testing. Let's just check it out. And it was very interesting to see the different individual reactions most of them, maybe not surprisingly, were not impressed in the sense that they're like, well, I could do this. And one of the braver employees admitted to me, again in a one-on-one, said, I feel like, that was a little scary because that is what I think my job is here, like all of that. And I was so happy that this person shared what was going on for him, like emotionally. And I wasn't intellectually surprised, but it allowed me to then just engage with him about, yes, but I want you to do 3x what you're doing now. But I know I don't want you working 3x the hours. Like, how can you use this as a tool? And there are some parts of this process that you even admit you don't have as much experience in. So outsource that, it's like, and so it just, it's a little example of kind of the management of trying to really engage. And, sometimes I want to move more quickly, but I'm like, I have to pause. I have to actually understand what is going on for people, particularly with something as potentially disruptive as AI and, all of the hype that they're reading too. And so really it's almost bespoke sometimes of what is like, how can this be adopted as a tool? I might see it as clear as day, but if the staff don't, you don't really get much past, step one.
Yeah, I think the two takeaways, that was awesome insight, Esther. But the two things for me were, one, how you bring people along in the journey. You make them part of the process so they feel, and it ties back to something you said earlier, which was, how do I start creating the advocates and the advocacy for change? And I thought that was a perfect example of how you do that, which is bringing people with you on the journey. And then the second thing, I worked for a gentleman by the name of Kirk Scoggin once. He runs the data center business at Lenovo now. And he always used to tell me, Rose, sometimes you have to slow down to speed up. And I think from your example in a management and leadership perspective, sometimes it's really important for you as the leader, though you may want to go faster, to take pause, understand the concerns, to bring your teams along with you. So two really good things that I heard in your response that really resonated with me. So thank you.
And you're the second guest now that we've had that has said that about AI, slow down to go fast. Like you can't just shove it through for many reasons. Well, speaking of something disruptive, I don't know if you guys know this, but we were just in a pandemic that was certainly disruptive. And, now we've got the post-pandemic workplace, which is looking for a lot of sort of corporate office-y type environments, kind of different. There's a mix of remote versus office-based work for a lot of organizations. And in general, I see a lot of organizations, understandably, just not sure exactly what the right mix of that is. We've both seen sort of frontline staff have a very different perspective on it than the leadership. And I'm just curious, from where you sit, one, what's the working model that you're using right now? And just, how's it going? How's it received by staff? And how do you think it's working?
We are, or at least in my division, we are using a hybrid and flex first. The norms that we have tried to establish are situational. So we are not being too prescriptive saying every Wednesday come to, this office, or you must be in an office at least 2 to 3 days a week. So we are not going that far, although the different division heads are doing it a little bit differently. I think we are moving towards something more common, and then I have quarterly in person. We do have a bit more of a remote team now. And so, the Wednesday every week would be hard for me to move to anyway, because they're be only a portion of some of the teams. And so when people come in, one of the small things that I wouldn't say we've mastered yet is don't fly in for just a half day session. If you're going to fly in, you know, make the most of your time, meet with other people. Or my division meetings have become more like retreats. And there's a trade-off there, because I think some people complain about it and say, oh, it's so much more time. I'm like, yeah, but if it's the only time in a quarter that we're all able to be together physically, like, we have to take advantage of that time together. I actually would say that for most of the staff, they feel like they are just as productive as they would be in an office environment. And I've read this, and it seems to be like one of the common points of view now. So the staff feel that way, but the leadership don't feel that way, which is the culture, the silo is the lack of, reduced, not lack of, but reduced ability to provide mentorship or apprenticeship seems very hard. So I would say that I see a similar dichotomy in our organization, where the staff still really get nervous about anything too prescriptive, and we're kind of moving it. But I have observed, based on even my own practices as a division leader, it's the more senior people are the ones coming in on a regular basis, and the more the rest of the staff are coming in much more selectively.
I was talking to someone who they're exact same. They're same setup as yours. And he was saying that he completely trusts his people to be productive remotely. That's not a problem. But he said, there is just something fundamentally different trying to manage a group when you don't see them very often. And he said it, I thought this was the most interesting metaphor. It's like, before the pandemic, I could manage in 3D, and now I manage in 2D. And I was like, oh, that is like such the perfect way to encapsulate what I've heard a lot of managers and division leaders saying. So I'm just curious if that's like, what's it been like for you, just as a person leading a division? How have you had to change?
Over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, the management style was much more about less command control, right? And more inclusive. There's too much change happening, in the marketplace. So sort of trying to be more of a questioning leader versus the kind of leader that has to know everything and be able to just help direct staff. And so that's been my own personal journey as a manager and leader, just kind of shifting the way I work and manage and motivate people. And quite frankly, increasingly learn as much from them as perhaps, back in the day when I could easily direct because I've done it 20,000 times. Now I'm like, well, I've kind of done something like that, but it's a very different context. So how do I might actually not know the right answer, but I have to make sure I'm surrounding myself with the right people and asking the right questions at the right time. So I think that journey combined with, I'm definitely a classic extrovert. I did a lot of walk around management, checking in, connections, relationships, like that is how I do. And in a virtual environment, you just can't do it that way. I've tried to replicate it in little ways, but it's like these one-off things. And yeah, there are tools, or Slack, I think, does a nice job of certain things that tries to kind of create some community. But I think it's hard. And I see, because most of my interactions with some of the staff can be pretty much through one-on-ones. There are team dynamics that are going on because I can hear it in my one-on-ones. And I think, but I might be a little biased because I am more of an extrovert, I think that stuff takes longer to work out when everything's virtual. Or you can have a lunch, you can go, but it's just that connectivity and that sort of cultural magic, and just being able to shout over the cube wall to be like, oh my God, look at this, da 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 da. Like, again, there are digital replacements for that, but it just doesn't feel quite the same, and two-dimensional, I would say. So
Yeah. So it just an interesting story. The very last webcast that I did before I retired, Esther, the awesome young gentleman, Dan Rodriguez, I'd love to get him on the pod at some point, asked me to come in and just, talk to what was my old team. And someone stood up and asked me, Rose, how do you build culture when our environment is completely virtual? And I will acknowledge, and Dana and I debate this a lot, I am a traditionalist. I like people to work at work. And my response was tell them to get back in the office. And it doesn't have to be, and just to be fair, like I would never say badge in at 8 and don't leave until, way after 5. I mean, we all lived in a hybrid work environment pre-pandemic, and I think we've all forgotten that. But just the flexibility, I think, is really important. And my big concern, and this leads to my next question for you, my big concern is for young people coming out of the workforce or into the workforce and out of college. They were sequestered in their dorm rooms when they started school. They've lost in some, not everyone, you hate to make big general rationalizations like this or statements like this, but many lost some ability for communication skills that was just prevalent when you had to go in and go to your neighbor next door in your dorm and say hello. Instead, they got penalized for leaving their rooms, right? So my concern is for young people. And I think there's a pervasive narrative that says people that are new to the workforce don't want to work in an office. And I've said this on previous episodes. Every single person in their 20s that I've asked this question to says, yes, I love some flexibility and I like hybrid, but I don't want to work for a company that's 100% virtual all the time. It's lonely. And that statement of what it's going to do to the mental health of our young people concerns me. What are you seeing from where you sit?
I share a similar concern. I also feel like at Consumer Reports, but like most organizations, once you get to a certain size, there's always silos, there's different groups, there's subcultures, even though, maybe not in every case, but the people that I work with most closely, we have a certain way of doing things. And even in the best version of ourselves, I could sit here and tell you, oh, we have great teams and good cultures and so on and so forth. So even if that were to be completely true, we're kind of not so great at working with other groups, or God forbid, because we did hire a lot of the staff that I oversee are new to Consumer Reports. So onboarding was super hard, and we were hiring other new people. I'm like, I don't even know who I don't know. I literally don't know. If we were all in an office, some of the times, knowing me, I would know because I'm a hallway talker. I chat people up in the cafeteria, right? And so I'm like, I'm not going to spend my Monday night studying our org chart. Like, I'm just not. And so how do you do that for both new, younger people? But I've noticed if you hire really at any level, getting them to understand that stuff that you can't put in a PowerPoint or in a policy document or in a training session, it just takes longer. And I also work with a fair amount of introverts. So again, it's okay for extroverts. They'll be like, oh, I'm just going to go contact Rose. I heard about her. There are people like that. There are a lot of people who are not. And so it kind of takes, Rose, what you were saying, but it's like even worse for people who like are not comfortable with, creating a network. I'm the exec sponsor of our Asian BRG, and that's been super fascinating because it's a cross section of employees that I do not work with. I never work with them, but it's this great view into this like other parts of the CR. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I just would never understand these parts of CR because they're just not really in my purview. But it takes a really specific role for me to actually get that kind of exposure. And so I'm always like, how do we expand this in a combination of organic and sometimes forced ways to overcompensate to like some of the things you're talking about, Rose, and some of the things I think we're all observing?
I've had this lens that the new work, the way we work now, mostly remote, would be great if you were an introvert because you never had to go do all this stuff. The comment that you made really opened my eyes in that, yeah, that's probably true, but it also impacts their ability to make connections and do work, which is the negative side of that lens. So that was super insightful. Thank you.
Oh yeah, and I remember I was facilitating a organizational retreat. So this was the entire organization, although it was a small organization, just 100 last year. And as a group, as an overall organization, we were having discussions about this and what's the right mix and so on. And I really appreciated how this young man was like, to be clear, like I'm an introvert and I would be happy to spend the rest of my days working from home. I just want to be honest about that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I really appreciated that. But he also very quickly was like, I recognize that there might be reasons for me to come in. But he did say, just so you know, I will be so interested to see where we've landed 5 to 10 years from now and what the connection is between the work format and results, and productivity and those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think there are these trends, at least that you read about pretty repeatedly, about how the younger generation just doesn't care about work in the same way we do. And I think, again, there's truth to that. Regardless, to me, I'm like, what do we do as a result of that? How do you still get people that are employees to show up and at least do the work? It's just a very different paradigm from, I think, our careers and what, I still am trying to figure out, well, what does that mean? And we're kind of in the middle of the beginning of that, right? Because Gen Z's coming in and I think they're a little bit different from the millennials. And so like with older millennials, or maybe most of millennials, like I still have very ambitious people who are like, I want to move up, I want to advance, I want to learn. And that one can do something with. I find it fascinating, by the way, that they won't go into the office where there's the CEO is likely to be. I'm like, there's a little bit there's some advantages there if you kind of show up and you end up, seeing like the top leaders in the organization are in either our city office or in our Yonkers. Like, there's still an interesting disconnect to, well, you want some advice, like one is go in and show up so that people kind of know your face and your name and the 3-dimensional version, and maybe have a coffee at the kitchen. I mean, it's very interesting observation that they don't see the connection or being able to observe a 3-dimensional meeting dynamic, like of what's going on with the body language. So it's not just our heads. It's just like a whole other bunch of stimulus going on in like that 3D world that I do worry about these younger people. It was really weird once we started meeting in person. It was overstimulating, actually.
Oh, and it was uncomfortable. Like, I am an extrovert.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I almost had to train myself and encourage myself to go out and engage. And I remember the first time I went back in and had a conversation, Esther, I wasn't super sharp and clear in my spoken word.
Oh,
like
yeah.
I kind of stumbled through. I'm like, oh my God, there's a person in front of me.
I think I remember in my first meeting where there were just, 4 or 5 of us, and we were all in this room. And just the mere notion of me needing to turn my head and make eye contact with the person to my left, I was like, that is so weird that this feels weird. Because you could argue most of my life and most of my working experience has been to do this. You turn and you look at the person you're engaged. And it was just a little too much in the beginning. And it took a little while to get used to. Imagine people who don't have the years of experience in their muscle memory.
And the confidence.
Yes. I felt very much out of my skin. And I'm like, oh my gosh, if I do, it's very, yeah.
Right. All right. Well, Esther, one last question. You've been so nice to give us your time. And you can pass on this or you can choose which one. But it was one of the last two I love asking folks is, either can you share a pivotal moment in your management and leadership journey, particularly on the people side? Or just can you highlight an aspect that you found fulfilling about when it comes to managing and leading people? Plenty of people, all of us included, can have our gripes when it comes to managing others. And those we have a right to that, but it can also be incredibly fulfilling. So I'm just curious if you'd weigh in on one of those for us.
I would say earlier in my career, and at the beginning of my career, I was probably a victim of that perfectionist complex. So I actually didn't speak up a lot in meetings. I mean, some of it's you're beginning your career. And yes, I went to business school, and I think that helped me with my confidence, but I was still a little bit on the quiet side, non-assertive, watched, learned. As that era. And I remember when, granted, it was, the internet, it was kind of crazy times. But I remember, had been promoted a few times and whatnot. And at one point, the head of our New York office was exited. I was working at an agency at the time. And they said, "Can you be president? Can you be interim president?" I thought they were crazy. I was like, what are you people talking about? I am so not qualified. I am so not ready. I am so no. Like, I actually said no. Like, I can't do this. And then I eventually did. And it was just the first of many subsequent moments in my career where I just never felt ready. I never felt necessarily completely qualified, but I learned you just have to lean over your skis and actually be logical, be strategic, but also be yourself through a combination of those things. I would say I continue to find myself in situations where I'm often leaning over my skis, but I don't know. I thought I would feel more comfortable by now, and I guess I do. But I guess my advice to others would be, particularly for women, I'm not sure, but you just have to know enough to be able to lead, and then you have to be enough of a human being to know how to manage. I know it's not that simple, but I would say that it just felt like such a shocking moment. And somehow I find myself in situations where I get thrown things and I'm like, oh, okay, all right, let's give it a go. Let's go. Yeah. And I'm like, at this point, I'm like, that's a formula of at least my success. You don't always have to have it all figured out.
Yep. Yep. And there is a lot of data that women do that to themselves more than men. But I also think it's a very just human feeling. And I do think that's a great message, Esther, to anyone who's feeling either nervous, maybe not sure if they want to take on a management or leadership role, just knowing nobody feels 100% ready to rock. Like, just give it a shot and do your best and learn.
Well, and what a great way and piece of advice and insight to wrap up the episode. And Esther, you've been so kind and giving with your time. Your insights were invaluable. I know Dana feels the same. We are so thankful that you took the time to be with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you for asking me. It was very fun to speak with you both.
Yet another excellent session with Esther. This episode in particular, I loved some of the key takeaways, not only about AI, but the work environment, and then her own struggles with her personal confidence in new roles. So what were your hot takes? Let's get into the specifics.
Again, everything, but particularly, I thought it was an interesting observation about now the virtual hybrid environment and how she's noticing that team tensions take longer to resolve themselves than they did when folks were with each other day to day. And again, I want to be clear. I'm not recommending we all return to the 5-day work week. I think we do need to acknowledge, though, what the impacts are of not doing that anymore. And she observed that one. that two people disagreed on an approach or something. I don't know exactly what she was thinking of, but that it just takes a little longer for those tensions to work out. So something many of our listeners are managing virtual teams now, and something to think about.
Before we move on, since we're talking about the workplace discussion, I thought it was fascinating when she acknowledged when you're not in the in-person environment, and I think we had the conversation of managing in 2D versus 3D, it's difficult for people to know what they don't know because they're not there to know that they don't know it.
Right.
Right? And I know that sounded complicated, but you don't know what you don't know if you don't know it, right? And you don't see it.
And you can't observe it. You start to figure out what you don't know by observing what's happening. And that is just way more limited.
And then she started talking about having conversations with people about their disconnect in their interest in progression, but then also not even realizing that themselves realizing that there's a lack of exposure. And that leads to a really interesting article I sent you this past week, Dana, about, I think it was the people who, they're starting to do studies about people who are in the office getting higher raises than the people that are virtual, right? Because you could put the productivity conversation in front of everyone. And I think we're starting to see that we can be productive in many modes. But humans are humans. Relationships are relationships. And people tend to, in a world where these types of decisions are made by people, the lack of exposure and visibility is starting to affect things like raises, promotions, et cetera. So I thought her acknowledgement and that data point that we saw last week were pretty interesting acknowledgments in this work environment.
Yeah. And as a slight quick tack onto that, so there's two ways that very specific thing you're talking about, I've seen it manifesting. One is this idea now of how are you going to be sure that your staff who are fully remote for some reason are going to have the same opportunities. But there's a flip side to that too, and I was so refreshed to hear this. I was speaking to someone who was probably in their 30s, and they, during the pandemic, had chosen to move hundreds of miles away from their organization. The organization said it was fine. You can work remotely. We definitely want to keep you here. I love what he said to me, though, which is he said, I know that choice might limit some of my opportunities at the organization.
There was acknowledgement and accountability.
Yeah, every one of us who makes the choice in terms of how much in person, not virtual, but in person, actually physically face to face, the choices we make around that will affect our opportunities. And while, of course, you want organizations to keep their eye on, you don't want true unfairness. You don't want true bias or discrimination against virtual. I do think you have to also own that you might be limiting yourself. So it will be, again, yet another thing that will be very interesting to see where we're at in 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could talk about this forever. I'll make one more quick point. If you move away from headquarters, there's less opportunities around from headquarters. Sorry. I mean, if you
Right.
decide to move to somewhere in Kansas and your company is headquartered in San Francisco area, there are just less job opportunities, period. So it's, again, just acknowledging that situation and being okay and being accountable.
Yeah, and being okay with it. Just know what you're getting into or not.
Yeah. One more thing that I absolutely love that she said is the story she told when they asked her to be the interim president. She said, I felt utterly unqualified and I said no. The hot take was, even though she didn't feel ready or qualified, she decided to just lean over her skis and go for it. And then the final point was, and she said, and still to this day, she feels uncomfortable with new challenging opportunities. And I think that's just a reminder for everyone that these situations, when you're pushed, are going to feel uncomfortable. But if you're not pushing, you're not growing, you're not learning. So it's normal. It's okay. It's normal.
For any age, right? We're in our 50s and we still feel that when we are taking on a new role or new situation that we know is going to be challenging. It doesn't matter how old you are.
Any other hot takes?
No, my immense gratitude to Esther Han. That's my final comment.
Thank you, Esther. And we will talk to you next week with another great interview on Maestro Mindset. Thank you, everyone.